Combray, Part 2. While my aunt gossiped on in this way with Françoise, I would have accompanied my parents to Mass. How I loved it! How clearly I can see it still, our church at Combray. The old porch by which we went in, black and full of holes as a cullender, was worn out of shape and deeply furrowed at the sides, as also was the holy water stoup to which it led us, just as if the gentle grazing touch of the cloaks of peasant women going into the church, and of their fingers dipping into the water, had managed by age-long repetition to acquire a destructive force, to impress itself on the stone, to carve ruts in it like those made by cart-wheels upon stone gate-posts against which they are driven every day. Its memorial stones, beneath which the noble dust of the abbots of Combray who were buried there furnished the choir with a sort of spiritual pavement, were themselves no longer hard and lifeless matter, for time had softened and sweetened them, and had made them melt like honey and flow beyond their proper margins, either surging out in a milky frothing wave, washing from its place of florid Gothic capital, drowning the white violets of the marble floor, or else reabsorbed into their limits, contracting still further a crabbed Latin inscription, bringing a fresh touch of fantasy into the arrangement of its curtailed characters, closing together two letters of some word, of which the rest were disproportionately scattered. Its windows were never so brilliant as on days when the sun scarcely shone, so that if it was dull outside you might be certain of fine weather in church. One of them was filled from top to bottom by a solitary figure, like the king on a playing card, who lived up there beneath his canopy of stone, between earth and heaven. And in the blue light of its slanting shadow, on weekdays sometimes at noon, when there was no service, at one of those rare moments when the airy, empty church, more human somehow and more luxurious with the sun showing off all its rich furnishings, seemed to have almost a habitable air, like the hall, all sculptured stone and painted glass, of some medieval mansion. On weekdays, when there was no service, you might see Madame Sazerat kneel for an instant, laying down on the chair beside her own a neatly corded parcel of little cakes which she had just bought at the baker's and was taking home for her luncheon. In another, a mountain of rosy snow, at whose foot a battle was being fought, seemed to have frozen the window also, which it swelled and distorted with its cloudy sleet, like a pane to which snowflakes have drifted and clung, but flakes illumined by a sunrise, the same, doubtless, which purpled the reredos of the altar with tints so fresh that they seemed rather to be thrown on it for a moment by a light shining from outside, and shortly to be extinguished, than painted and permanently fastened on the stone. And all of them were so old that you could see, here and there, their silvery antiquity sparkling with the dust of centuries, and showing in its threadbare brilliance the very chords of their lovely tapestry of glass. There was one among them which was a tall panel composed of 100 little rectangular windows, of blue principally, like the great game of patience of the kind planned to beguile King Charles VI. But, either because a ray of sunlight had gleamed through it, or because my own shifting vision had drawn across the window, whose colours died away and were rekindled by turns, a rare and transient fire, the next instant it had taken on all the iridescence of a peacock's tail, then shook and wavered in a flaming and fantastic shower, distilled and dropping from the groin of the dark and rocky vault down the moist walls, as though it were along a bed of some rainbow grotto of sinuous stalactites that I was following my parents, who marched before me, their prayer books clasped in their hands. A moment later the little lozenge windows had put on the deep transparence, the unbreakable hardness of sapphires clustered on some enormous breastplate, but beyond which could be distinguished, dearer than all such treasures, a fleeting smile from the sun, which could be seen and felt as well here, in the blue and gentle flood in which it washed the masonry, as on the pavement of the square, or the straw of the market-place. And even on our first Sundays, when we came down before Easter, it would console me for the blackness and bareness of the earth outside by making burst into blossom, as in some springtime in old history among the heirs of St. Louis, this dazzling and gilded carpet of forget-me-nots in glass. Two tapestries of high warp represented the coronation of Esther, in which tradition would have it that the weaver had given to Ahasuerus the features of one of the kings of France, and to Esther those of a lady of Guermantes whose lover he had been. Their colors had melted into one another so as to add expression, relief, light to the pictures. A touch of red over the lips of Esther had strayed beyond their outline. The yellow on her dress was spread with such unctuous plumpness as to have acquired a kind of solidity, and stood boldly out from the receding atmosphere, while the green of the trees, which was still bright in silken wool among the lower parts of the panel, but had quite gone at the top, separated in a paler scheme above the dark trunks the yellowing upper branches, tanned and half obliterated by the sharp though sidelong rays of an invisible sun. All these things, and, still more than these, the treasures which had come to the church from personages who, to me, were almost legendary figures, such as the golden cross wrought, it was said, by Saint Eloi and presented by Dagobert, and the tomb of the sons of Louis the Germanic in porphyry and enamelled copper, because of which I used to go forward into the church when we were making our way to our chairs, as into a fairy-haunted valley, where the rustic sees with amazement on a rock, a tree, a marsh, the tangible proofs of the little people's supernatural passage. All these things made the church for me something entirely different from the rest of the town, a building which occupied, so to speak, 4 dimensions of space, the name of the fourth being time, which had sailed the centuries with that old nave, where bay after bay, chapel after chapel seemed to stretch across and hold down and conquer not merely a few yards of soil, but each successive epoch from which the whole building had emerged triumphant, hiding the rugged barbarities of the 11th century in the thickness of its walls, through which nothing could be seen of the heavy arches, long stopped and blinded with coarse blocks of ashlar, except where, near the porch, a deep groove was furrowed into one wall by the tower stair. And even there the barbarity was veiled by the graceful Gothic arcade which pressed coquettishly upon it, like a row of grown-up sisters who, to hide him from the eyes of strangers, arrange themselves smilingly in front of a countrified, unmannerly, and ill-dressed younger brother, rearing into the sky above the square a tower which had looked down upon St. Louis and seemed to behold him still, and thrusting down with its crypt into the blackness of the Merovingian night, through which, guiding us with groping fingertips beneath the shadowy vault, ribbed strongly as an immense bat's wing of stone, Theodore or his sister would light up for us with a candle the tomb of Sigebert's little daughter, in which a deep hole like the bed of a fossil had been bored, or, so it was said, by a crystal lamp which, on the night when the Frankish princess was murdered, had left, of its own accord, the golden chains by which it was suspended where the apse is today, and with neither the crystal broken nor the light extinguished, had buried itself in the stone, through which it had gently forced its way. And then the apse of Combray. What am I to say of that? It was so coarse, so devoid of artistic beauty, even of the religious spirit. From outside, since the street crossing which it commanded was on a lower level, its great wall was thrust upwards from a basement of unfaced ashlar, jagged with flints, in all of which there was nothing particularly ecclesiastical. The windows seemed to have been pierced at an abnormal height, and its whole appearance was that of a prison wall rather than that of a church. And certainly in later years, were I to recall all the glorious apses that I had seen, it would never enter my mind to compare with any one of them the apse of Combray. Only, one day, turning out of a little street in some country town, I came upon three alleyways that converged, and facing them an old wall, rubbed, worn, crumbling, and unusually high, with windows pierced in it far overhead, and the same asymmetrical appearance of the apse of Combray. And at that moment I did not say to myself, as at Chartres I might have done, or at Reims, with what strength the religious feeling had been expressed in its construction, but instinctively I exclaimed, "The Church! The Church! A dear familiar friend!" close pressed in the Rue Saint Hilaire, upon which its north door opened, by its two neighbours, Madame Loiseau's house and the pharmacy of Monsieur Rapin, against which its walls rested without interspace. A simple citizen of Combray, who might have had her number in the street, had the streets of Combray borne numbers, and at whose door one felt that the postman ought to stop on his morning rounds, before going into Madame Loiseau's and after leaving Monsieur Rapin's, there existed for all that, between the church and everything in Combray that was not the church, a clear line of demarcation which I had never succeeded in eliminating from my mind. In vain might Madame Loiseau deck her window-sills with fuchsias, which developed the bad habit of letting their branches trail at all times and in all directions, head downwards, and whose flowers had no more important business, when they were big enough to taste the joys of life, than to go and cool their purple congested cheeks against the dark front of the church. To me such conduct sanctified the fuchsias not at all. Between the flowers and the blackened stones towards which they leaned, if my eyes could discern no interval, my mind preserved the impression of an abyss. From a long way off one could distinguish and identify the steeple of Saint Hilaire, inscribing its unforgettable form upon a horizon beneath which Combray had not yet appeared. When, from the train which brought us down from Paris at Easter time, my father caught sight of it as it slipped into every fold of the sky in turn, its little iron cock veering continually in all directions, he would say, "Come, get your wraps together, we are there." and on one of the longest walks we ever took from Combray there was a spot where the narrow road emerged suddenly on to an immense plain, closed at the horizon by strips of forest, over which rose and stood alone the fine point of Saint Hilaire's steeple, but so sharpened and so pink that it seemed to be no more than sketched on the sky by the fingernail of a painter, anxious to give to such a landscape, to so pure a piece of nature, this little sign of art, this single indication of human existence. As one drew near it and could make out the remains of the square tower, half in ruins, which still stood by its side, though without rivaling it in height, one was struck first of all by the tone, reddish and sombre, of its stones, and on a misty morning in autumn one would have called it, to see it rising above the violet thundercloud of the vineyards, a ruin of purple, almost the color of the wild vine. Often in the square, as we came home, my grandmother would make me stop to look up at it. From the tower windows, placed two and two, one pair above another, with that right and original proportion in their spacing, to which not only human faces owe their beauty and dignity, it released, it let fall at regular intervals flights of jackdaws, which for a little while would wheel and caw, as though the ancient stones which allowed them to sport thus and never seemed to see them, becoming of a sudden uninhabitable and discharging some infinitely disturbing element, had struck them and driven them forth. Then, after patterning everywhere the violet velvet of the evening air, abruptly soothed, they would return and be absorbed in the tower, deadly no longer, but benignant, some perching here and there, not seeming to move, but snapping perhaps and swallowing some passing insect, perching on the points of turrets, as a seagull perches with an angler's immobility on the crest of a wave. Without quite knowing why, my grandmother found in the steeple of Saint Hilaire that absence of vulgarity, pretension, and meanness which made her love, and deem rich in beneficent influences, nature itself, when the hand of man had not, as did my great aunt's gardener, trimmed it, and the works of genius. And certainly every part one saw of the church served to distinguish the whole from any other building by a kind of general feeling which pervaded it, but it was in the steeple that the church seemed to display a consciousness of itself, to affirm its individual and responsible existence. It was the steeple which spoke for the church. I think, too, that in a confused way my grandmother found in the steeple of Combray what she prized above anything else in the world, namely, a natural air, and an air of distinction. Ignorant of architecture, she would say, "My dears, laugh at me if you like. It is not conventionally beautiful, but there is something in its quaint old face which pleases me. If it could play the piano, I am sure it would really play." And when she gazed on it, when her eyes followed the gentle tension, the fervent inclination of its stony slopes which drew together as they rose, like hands joined in prayer, she would absorb herself so utterly in the outpouring of the spire that her gaze seemed to leap upwards with it, her lips at the same time curving in a friendly smile for the worn-out old stones of which the setting sun now illumined no more than the topmost pinnacles, which, at the point where they entered that zone of sunlight and were softened and sweetened by it, seemed to have mounted suddenly far higher, to have become truly remote, like a song whose singer breaks into falsetto an octave above the accompanying air. It was the steeple of Saint Hilaire which shaped and crowned and consecrated every occupation, every hour of the day, every point of view in the town. From my bedroom window I could discern no more than its base, which had been freshly covered with slates. But when on Sundays I saw these, in the hot light of a summer morning, blaze like a black sun, I would say to myself, "Good heavens, 9 o'clock! I must get ready for Mass at once, if I am to have time to go in and kiss Aunt Leonie first." And I would know exactly what was the color of the sunlight upon the square. I could feel the heat and dust of the market, the shade behind the blinds of the shop, into which Mamma would perhaps go on her way to Mass, penetrating its odor of unbleached calico to purchase a handkerchief or something, of which the draper himself would let her see what he had, bowing from the waist, who, having made everything ready for shutting up, had just gone into the back shop to put on his Sunday coat and to wash his hands, which it was his habit every few minutes, and even on the saddest occasions, to rub one against the other with an air of enterprise, cunning, and success. And again, after Mass, when we looked in to tell Theodore to bring a larger loaf than usual, because our cousins had taken advantage of the fine weather to come over from Taberzie for luncheon, we had in front of us the steeple, which, baked in brown itself like a larger loaf still of holy bread, with flakes and sticky drops on it of sunlight, pricked its sharp point into the blue sky. And in the evening, as I came in from my walk and thought of the approaching moment when I must say good night to my mother and see her no more, the steeple was by contrast so kindly there at the close of day, that I would imagine it as being laid, like a brown velvet cushion, against, as being thrust into the pallid sky which had yielded beneath its pressure, had sunk slightly so as to make room for it, and had correspondingly risen on either side, while the cries of the birds wheeling to and fro about it seemed to intensify its silence, to elongate its spire still further, and to invest it with some quality beyond the power of words. Even when our errands lay in places behind the church, from which it could not be seen, the view seemed always to have been composed with reference to the steeple, which would stand up, now here, now there, among the houses, and was perhaps even more affecting when it appeared thus without the church. And, indeed, there are many others which look best when seen in this way, and I can call to mind vignettes of housetops with surmounting steeples in quite another category of art than those formed by the dreary streets of Combray. I shall never forget, in a quaint Norman town not far from Baalbek, two charming 18th century houses, dear to me and venerable for many reasons, between which, when one looks up at them from a fine garden which descends in terraces to the river, the Gothic spire of a church, itself hidden by the houses, soars into the sky with the effect of crowning and completing their fronts, but in a material so different, so precious, so beringed, so rosy, so polished, that it is at once seen to be no more a part of them than would be a part of two pretty pebbles lying side by side, between which it had been washed on the shore, the purple crinkled spire of some sea-shell spun out into a turret, and gay with glossy color. Even in Paris, in one of the ugliest parts of town, I know a window from which one can see across a first, a second, and even a third layer of jumbled roofs, street beyond street, a violet bell, sometimes ruddy, sometimes, too, in the finest prints which the atmosphere makes of it, of an ashy solution of black, which is, in fact, nothing else than the dome of St. Augustine, and which imparts to this view of Paris the character of some of the Piranesi views of Rome. But since into none of these little etchings, whatever the taste my memory may have been able to bring to their execution, was it able to contribute an element I have long lost, the feeling which makes us not merely regard a thing as a spectacle, but believe in it as in a creature without parallel, so none of them keeps in dependence on it a whole section of my inmost life, as does the memory of those aspects of the steeple of Combray from the streets behind the church. Whether one saw it at 5 o'clock, when going to call for letters at the post office, some doors away from one on the left, raising abruptly with its isolated peak the ridge of housetops, or again, when one had to go in and ask for news of Madame Sazerat, one's eyes followed the line where it ran low again beyond the farther descending slope, and one knew that it would be the second turning after the steeple. Or yet again, if pressing further afield one went to the station, one saw it obliquely, showing in profile fresh angles and surfaces, like a solid body surprised at some unknown point in its revolution. Or from the banks of the Vivonne, the apse, drawn muscularly together and heightened in perspective, seemed to spring upwards with the effort which the steeple made to hurl its spire point into the heart of heaven. It was always to the steeple that one must return, always it which dominated everything else, summing up the houses with an unexpected pinnacle, raised before me like the finger of God, whose body might have been concealed below among the crowd of human bodies without fear of my confounding it for that reason with them. And so, even today, in any large provincial town, or in a quarter of Paris which I do not know well, if a passer-by who is putting me on the right road shows me from afar, as a point to aim at, some belfry of a hospital, or a convent steeple lifting the peak of its ecclesiastical cap at the corner of the street which I am to take, my memory need only find in it some dim resemblance to that dear and vanished outline, and the passer-by, should he turn round to make sure that I have not gone astray, would see me, to his astonishment, oblivious of the walk that I had planned to take, or the place where I was obliged to call, standing still on the spot, before that steeple, for hours on end, motionless, trying to remember, feeling deep within myself a tract of soil reclaimed from the waters of Lethe, slowly drying until the buildings rise on it again. And then, no doubt, and then more uneasily than when, just now, I asked him for a direction, I will seek my way again, I will turn a corner, but the goal is in my heart. On our way home from Mass we would often meet Monsieur Legrandin, who, detained in Paris by his professional duties as an engineer, could only, except in the regular holiday seasons, visit his home at Combray between Saturday evenings and Monday mornings. He was one of that class of men who, apart from a scientific career in which they may well have proved brilliantly successful, have acquired an entirely different kind of culture, literary or artistic, of which they make no use in the specialized work of their profession, but by which their conversation profits. More literary than many men of letters, we were not aware at this period that Monsieur Legrandin had a distinct reputation as a writer, and so were greatly astonished to find that a well-known composer had set some verses of his to music. more literary than many men of letters, endowed with a greater ease in execution than many painters, they imagine that the life they are obliged to lead is not that for which they are really fitted, and they bring to their regular occupations either a fantastic indifference or a sustained and lofty application, scornful, bitter, and conscientious. Tall, with a good figure, a fine thoughtful face, drooping fair moustaches, a look of disillusionment in his blue eyes, an almost exaggerated refinement of courtesy. A talker such as we had never heard, he was, in the sight of my family, who never ceased to quote him as an example, the very pattern of a gentleman, who took life in the noblest and most delicate manner. My grandmother alone found fault with him for speaking a little too well, a little too much like a book, for not using a vocabulary as natural as his loosely knotted lavalier neckties, his short, straight, almost schoolboyish coat. She was astonished, too, at the furious invective which he was always launching at the aristocracy, at fashionable life, and at snobbishness. Undoubtedly, he would say, the sin of which St. Paul is thinking when he speaks of the sin for which there is no forgiveness. Worldly ambition was a thing which my grandmother was so little capable of feeling, or indeed of understanding, that it seemed to her futile to apply so much heat to its condemnation. Besides, she thought it in not very good taste that Monsieur Legrandin, whose sister was married to a country gentleman of Lower Normandy near Balbec, should deliver himself of such violent attacks upon the nobles, going so far as to blame the Revolution for not having guillotined them all. "Well met, my friends," he would say as he came towards us. "You are lucky to spend so much time here. Tomorrow I have to go back to Paris, to squeeze back into my niche." Oh, I admit, he went on, with his own peculiar smile, gently ironical, disillusioned, and vague, I have every useless thing in the world in my house there. The only thing wanting is the necessary thing, a great patch of open sky like this. Always try to keep a patch of sky above your life, little boy," he added, turning to me. "You have a soul in you of rare quality, an artist's nature. Never let it starve for lack of what it needs." When, on our reaching the house, my aunt would send to ask us whether Madame Goupil had indeed arrived late for Mass, not one of us could inform her. Instead, we increased her anxiety by telling her that there was a painter at work in the church, copying the window of Gilbert the Bad. Françoise was at once dispatched to the grocer's, but returned empty-handed owing to the absence of Theodore, whose dual profession of choir-man, with a part in the maintenance of the fabric, and of grocer's assistant, gave him not only relations with all sections of society, but an encyclopedic knowledge of their affairs. "Ah," my aunt would sigh, "I wish it were time for Eulalie to come. She is really the only person who will be able to tell me." Eulalie was a limping, energetic, deaf spinster who had retired after the death of Madame de la Bretonnière, with whom she had been in service from her childhood, and had then taken a room beside the church, from which she would incessantly emerge, either to attend some service, or, when there was no service, to say a prayer by herself, or to give Theodore a hand. The rest of her time she spent in visiting sick persons like my Aunt Léonie, to whom she would relate everything that had occurred at Mass or Vespers. She was not above adding occasional pocket money to the little income which was found for her by the family of her old employers, by going from time to time to look after the curé's linen, or that of some other person of note in the clerical world of Combray. Above a mantle of black cloth she wore a little white coif that seemed almost to attach her to some order, and an infirmity of the skin had stained part of her cheeks and her crooked nose the bright red color of balsam. Her visits were the one great distraction in the life of my Aunt Léonie, who now saw hardly anyone else except the Reverend Curé. My aunt had, by degrees, erased every other visitor's name from her list, because they all committed the fatal error, in her eyes, of falling into one or other of the two categories of people she most detested. One group, the worse of the two, and the one of which she rid herself first, consisted of those who advised her not to take so much care of herself, and preached, even if only negatively and with no outward signs beyond an occasional disapproving silence or doubting smile, and preached the subversive doctrine that a sharp walk in the sun and a good red beefsteak would do her more good, her who had had 2 dreadful sips of Vichy water on her stomach for 14 hours, would do her more good than all her medicine bottles and her bed. The other category was composed of people who appeared to believe that she was more seriously ill than she thought, in fact, that she was as seriously ill as she said. And so none of those whom she had allowed upstairs to her room, after considerable hesitation and at Francoise's urgent request, and who, in the course of their visit, had shown how unworthy they were of the honor which had been done them by venturing a timid, "Don't you think that if you were just to stir out a little on really fine days," or who, on the other hand, when she said to them, "I am very low, nearing the end, dear friends," had replied, "Ah, yes, when one has no strength left, still you may last a while yet," each party alike might be certain that her doors would never open to them again. And if Francoise was amused by the look of consternation on my aunt's face whenever she saw from her bed any of these people in the Rue du Saint Esprit who looked as if they were coming to see her, or heard her own doorbell ring, she would laugh far more heartily, as at a clever trick, at my aunt's devices, which never failed, for having them sent away, and at their look of discomfiture when they had to turn back without having seen her, and would be filled with secret admiration for her mistress, whom she felt to be superior to all these other people, inasmuch as she could and did contrive not to see them. In short, my aunt stipulated, at one and the same time, that whoever came to see her must approve of her way of life, commiserate with her in her sufferings, and assure her of an ultimate recovery.